OTA just dropped. This is quite an update. Let's talk about it. The first and most important thing happening in this OTA is a change to Gambit Horsemen of Death. And I was lucky enough to be able to announce this one a couple days early on my Twitter. So that was good that Marvel Snap let me do that because there's a big bundle with this guy and it's unclear how this change is going to impact him. He's going from 3-3 to 3-5, but in exchange, he is blowing up one less cost of things. So he's going to be blowing up only 3 cost of things total. This is a particularly interesting direction to go because I think for a lot of high-end players, copying a bunch of Gambits wasn't really a common thing to do. He showed up a lot more as just like, oh, I'll play him, and then what I'm actually going to do is copy V-Hands or copy Sasquatches or do really anything that isn't just copying him. And I think this actually becomes more of a prominent way to go about playing him after this change than the previous. He becomes less of a target for copies here and more of a just, this is a fine card to play on rate. It is a good follow-up to an Iron Patriot now, and then I'll go figure out what the thing I'm actually copying is later in the game. This is also something that makes it a little bit easier to account for Gambit in deck building. Not that blowing up 4s was a particularly big part of why he was good, but accounting for him in deck building can now just mean having enough power from 4s, 5s, and 6s that you just don't care about anything he does. For example, Doom 2099, the entire power output of that deck now is basically out of reach of what Gambit is trying to actually do. And while I do think that he'll still remain a strong card, what I think this change fundamentally is doing is A, making him a little bit less annoying, and B, probably making him a bit of a worse card. I think pretty reasonably that extra point of blowing things up is worth more than the 2 points that he got, but it does make Gambit better at following up Iron Patriot, a better card in a general sense just to be included in your deck, and better when you fail to actually achieve his condition. So the question is how much that matters versus how much the probable nerf in terms of output matters. My guess is this is pretty close to a lateral move with plus or minus 10% going either way. It could be a card that gets 10% better, it could be a card that gets 10% worse, but mostly I think it's going to be a fairly similar card to what it used to be in terms of outright power. Where it's actually getting hit is it's just going to be fundamentally a less BS card. And what I mean by that is a lot of what sucked about Gambit is there were enough games where you could just copy him enough times that your opponent didn't have a board. And removing 4-cost cards from the list of things that get hit by this guy goes a meaningful way towards making that happen a lot less. And the reason for that is that not every deck plays 5s and 6s, but pretty much every deck plays 4s, and they are now capable of saying, I know for a fact that these cards will live. I'm not sure that actually fixes what people don't like about Gambit. I think what people don't like about Gambit is part that, and part the fact that he is kind of a tech card, right? So the fact that your tech card is getting all this extra value, like he's still going to be able to like dunk on Batroc decks when you copy him, be very good against TOV decks when you copy him. And I think that maybe it's possible that this doesn't address that in a meaningful enough way. But generally speaking, I tend to be the kind of person who doesn't want to nerf things too heavily because of the hit to consumer confidence that it means when someone has engaged in the system that Marvel Snap has for acquiring cards to acquire a card, for that card to later be changed in a meaningful way. This is like a big part of like the sort of ethos that I talk about. Like if you watch me long enough, you'll get a sense that I tend to be pretty lenient towards new busted cards out of fear of changing them such that it is a rug pull, basically. That is the sort of eye by which I look at this stuff. And through that lens, I think this is a change that I generally do support. I don't know if it's going to be the final form that Gambit takes, because I do think that while it does reduce the amount of BS, by not making the card all that much weaker, it might actually increase the amount of gambits you see. Because this is now a better card if you're someone who already understood that spamming gambits was not really the thing you did with this guy. And he's still going to be pretty reasonable to spam in certain matchups, and that's still going to make people upset. So I think this is an attempt at trying to hit that happy medium. I just don't know if it does. I think they should be commended for trying, but I also wouldn't be surprised if this ended up still being a little bit much for some people. Next up, Angel going to 2-4 is a pretty interesting thing for them to do here, because there have been a couple of what I think you'd call fairly mediocre cards that are going to 2-4 and suddenly are like much more real considerations. Cable's probably the poster boy for this, where if that card was a 2-3, nobody would ever play it, but at 2-4, it's like, oh yeah, you know, there's something to be said for that. I do think that it's good that these sort of archetype-specific cards are getting these buffs. Like, that kind of thing is important. You don't just want, like, generically playable cards to have the good stat line. You want some archetype-specific cards that are particularly not great, like Angel, to have that stat line. And I think a free 4 power, whether it comes from hand or deck, is still going to be something that some decks will be interested in. It's just Angel's a little bit miscast as a destroy card, right? Because the destroy archetypes generally aren't that interested in it. When you look at what those archetypes are actually doing, they don't care about 4 free power all that much. They're doing sort of combo-y things a lot of the time. And the decks that would care about 4 free power care a lot more about something that enables their combos, which is why a lot of when you actually see Angel is in a Dormammu deck, just so you have the correct volume of things to blow up for Dormammu to actually show up on the board. He tends to not be a card that shows up according to his power. So this doesn't feel like a super meaningful buff, but I do like that they're giving this guy the power. I think it's like just the kind of thing they should do, even if it's not going to be super meaningful with the technical aspects of how he's used. I swear I've been asking for this one for like 2 years. Deathlok to 3-6 feels like a pretty free thing for them to do that has been pretty free for an extended period of time. Deathlok has been card 12 or 13 in various destroy archetypes basically forever. When he originally came out, the premise of the card was that since this is a card that is for the destroy archetype and doesn't really show up outside of that, we're going to cost it as if the destroy is a downside, because in many cases it will be a downside. And 3-5 was a good stat line back in 2022. It's not a very particularly good stat line now. We have 3-5s with upside now. 3-6s with upside, even if you think what Luna Snow is upside, which means that this is just a very safe thing for them to do. Now, if I were to be cynical, I would suggest that they feel comfortable giving this extra power to Deathlok, because it is notably likely, at least in my mind, that he might be replaced by the upcoming Tombstone card in 2 seasons. If you want to see more about Tombstone, I did a review of the Datamined Spider-Man Brand New Day season only yesterday. But I do think that this is just a free change, and even if he does end up replaced by Tombstone, we still get 2 months out of this, and it just seems very reasonable to give this guy an extra point of power when he has been, for such an extended period of time, the worst of the destroy cards. You'd rather play Carnage most of the time, you'd rather play Venom most of the time. Those are the ones that actually show up in other decks outside of dedicated destroy. Deathlok is the one that very rarely does, and even in dedicated destroy, sometimes he's the one that gets cut. Obvious buff candidate, glad they did it. Hellcow is a card that, through no fault of her own, has sort of been pigeonholed into a role, and the fundamental thing going on here is that an activate discard, the upside of that is that you can discard things with the timing that you want, and in Marvel Snap, that sort of pigeonholes this card as a Hella card, right? This is a card that you really only use when you want to discard something, and it doesn't really matter what that thing is, or when you want an extra proc of discard. So, like, maybe you could use it like you have a Dracula on the board, you play a MODOK on the final turn, you activate this for another 4 power on the Apocalypse. That doesn't seem like a good use of it, right? But what is a good use of it, or what was at least a good use of it when it was discarding 2 cards, is activating it and then Hella reveals. So you just do that on turn 6, get 2 extra procs out of your Hella, and things are amazing for you. And that is really all that Activate Hellcow has ever done. Fundamentally, that's just kind of it, right? And so 4/7, sure, good thing to do. Don't think it matters in any meaningful way. The other thing that this makes me think of when I see 4/7 Hellcow is there used to be a sort of like heuristic, like, 3/5, that's a good stat line. 4/7, that's a good stat line. I don't think that's true anymore. And I actually think it scales very differently. Like, yeah, 3/5, that's a pretty okay stat line. Maybe 3/6, that's a good stat line. I think the number for 4s is like dramatically higher. And part of that is that you can play 2 3s on the final turn of the game and you can't play 2 4s on the final turn of the game. And 3 and 4 are probably the most interesting cost for me to analyze in this context because of that, because there is sort of clearly a delineation between cards that should be a 3 and should be a 4. But frankly, when I look at this version of Hellcow and they're like trying to make it a better 4, I mostly just think that it should be a 3. I think it should be a cheaper card that is easier to include in other decks, because as long as it is a 4, it's going to be about what the text is, because they're not going to feel particularly comfortable putting the power on this to actually make it be worth playing, because if it was just a power card, then you'd be playing it and not ever activating it, right? And so, like, let's say they put the 10 power on here that it would probably need for me to be excited about this card, but I'd just be playing it in Sauron. It'd be a 4/10. I wouldn't be, like, doing anything with it, right? I'd be discounting my Scar. So this is a card that's sort of trapped, and my instinct is that to get it out of that trap, you want to make it cheaper, like maybe a 3/5 Hellcow. Lady Sif to 3/6 I really like. I've complained recently that the only 3/6s in the games are Wave and Luna Snow, and it makes no sense that like these specific archetypal cards get to be 3/6 and a bunch of other specific archetypal cards do not get to be 3/6. Lady Sif going to 3/6, Deathlok to 3/6 addresses the problem that I'm talking about in a particularly meaningful way. Lady Sif probably a better card for the deck that it goes in than Deathlok is. Being able to compete on stats is really all that deck has going for it, so every bit of points that it can possibly get is helpful. Lady Sif 3/6, this one to me feels like the easiest slam dunk of all of them. This is a great change. There is nothing bad that I can say about this. Anything they do that makes early game Marvel Snap cards scale better into the late game, I will always be in favor of. This is a card you get very early on the collection track. Anything they do to make it more viable for people who have 40,000 collection level, I am never going to complain about. Awesome Andy is now probably just like a pretty solid rate 2 here. The big question for Awesome Andy is, as a rate 2, is he going to realize his output enough to be a rate 2 in a sort of priority-based kind of deck? One of the really interesting things about being a rate 2 is that you kind of need to realize your gains pretty quickly. The rate 2s that realize their gains quickly, things like Lizard that can allow you to snowball further with a Wilson Fisk, tend to be better than the rate 2s that don't realize their gains quickly, like Juggernaut Horseman of War, which isn't going to be able to let you play Wilson Fisk and isn't a particularly good target for things like Techno-Organic Virus and won't get you priority so you can play Supergiant and Negasonic them. And this guy seems like sort of halfway between those things. It's not going to get you Wilson Fisk, which is a problem, but it is a little bit easier to realize this than it is to realize Juggernaut Horseman of War, and I think there is something to be said for that. This is the kind of deck card that could maybe replace, a Scani Sun in some of the decks that are running around doing various rock-related things. Like this into Debris, activate this is a pretty interesting priority play, right? Because you're going to have those rocks, you're going to buff those rocks, and then you can start TOVing. There's not nothing there. It's just, I do think that right now in the archetypes that are based around like, here are my efficient stats, a lot of them are TOV decks. I do think he'll be second fiddle to whatever allows you to play Wilson Fisk, but I also think he's going to be a meaningfully better card. In as much as we're doing Jocasta stuff ever, he's obviously going to be better at 2/3 than he was at 2/2, and that's a reasonable consideration as well, I think. This Marvel effectively getting a potential 2 points of power, now giving a +6 buff to the side lanes that she's hitting instead of a +5 buff. I think a lot of people are anchored high on Miss Marvel because she released in a particularly unique state of Marvel Snap. There was a time when this was one of the best cards in the game, and she had very different text at that time. But one of the things that happens in a game like this is people remember, oh, this card used to be good, and so it's got to be good now that they've improved it a little bit. And I think that anchoring is problematic because people don't remember the very specific context in which this card was really, really good, which is to say, The specific context in which this card was really, really good was one where they had nerfed basically every scaler in Marvel Snap. And now, where people are actually playing Miss Marvel, they're playing her as a method of duplication, right? Like, this is a card that gets played with Prodigy. This is a card that gets played with Ancient One. This is a card that gets played where the goal is to take her and multiply her, because no longer are you actually happy just playing a 417. You got to be scaling upwards too. And I think that the specific situation, the circumstances of Ms. Marvel's release being that she was the 415 when she came out, basically, was like actually good. I think that those circumstances are not particularly likely to be replicated. So the question is are we going to be able to build something where it's multiplicative? I do like that. One of the things that is something that I notice a lot is whenever they change the power on anything ever, a bunch of Cerebro players come out of the woodwork and they complain about whatever that power change is. Or alternatively, a bunch of Cerebro players show up and they're like, I can't believe we just got X in Cerebro. And it almost never matters. Like the reason I notice this is because it happens every time and it just never ever matters. Both ways, right? Like, even when I'm like, oh, I'm afraid of Frigga and Cerebro 3. What happened? Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. It was totally fine. I do like that they were like, well, Miss Marvel's a pretty important card in Cerebro 5. What if we buffed her ability instead and left Cerebro 5 there? So for all the Cerebro gamers who every time they change the power of any card ever, I know there is somebody out there who is playing Angel in their Cerebro 3 list and they're like, I can't believe they broke my Cerebro 3 list. Guys, anytime they change power, somebody's Cerebro list is going to get got. But I do appreciate that they did avoid that for Miss Marvel specifically. I think that's like a pretty good thing for them to do. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.